Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Driven, Rush in the 90s and in the End, by Martin Popoff. Read by Michael Butler Murray. Introduction. The book you are now listening to marks the conclusion of a trilogy, a long journey down the path of progressive metal greatness. It started with Anthem, Rush in the 70s, and was perpetuated and provoked by Limelight, Rush in the 80s. And it concludes now, beyond bittersweet, after the death of Neil Peart from brain cancer on January 7th, 2020. The dark news came to light near the end of the production process for Anthem and Limelight. So in those books, Neil remains forever alive and disseminating his wisdoms as the Professor. But the tragic end of one of rock's towering greats can't be avoided any longer, and so it is part of this story. For now, however, some background for you on the subject of this book. If you are wondering why, or indeed how, this book exists, let me explain, quoting more or less verbatim from the intro of the first book, from way back, Anthem, if I may. There I wrote, "As you may be aware, this is my fourth Rush book, following Contents Under Pressure, 30 Years of Rush at Home and Away, Rush, The Illustrated History, and Rush, Album by Album. And since those, there have been a number of interesting developments that made me want to write this one. To start, only one of those three books, Contents, was a traditional biography, an authorized one at that. But it was quite short, and given that it came out in 2004 before Rush was officially retired, it was in need of an update. I thought about it, but I wasn't feeling it, not without some vigorous additions. That, fortunately, took care of itself. In the early 2010s, I found myself working with Sam Dunn and Scott McFadden at Banger Films on the award-winning documentary Rush, Beyond the Lighted Stage. Anybody who works in docs will tell you that between the different speakers and non-talk footage that has to get into what might end up a 90-minute film, only a tiny percentage of the interview footage ever gets used. The rest just sits in archive, rarely seen or heard by anyone. Long and short of it, I arranged to use that archive, along with more interviews I'd done over the years, plus the odd quote from the available press, to get this book to the point where I felt it was bringing something new and significant to the table of Rush books. So there you have it. Thanks in large part to those guys, as well as the kind consent of Peggy Ciccone at the Rush office. The book you are listening to more than aptly supplants Contents Under Pressure, and stands as the most strident and detailed analysis of the Rush catalog in existence. Now to the present tome, what to make of Rush in the 90s and, in the end, so to speak, the 2000s and the 2010s, right up until the band's retirement in 2015, and the great loss to family and friends, resulting from Neil's being taken from us in 2020. Obviously, we'll get to that. But this is the place for a spot of personal reflection. So here goes. As an angry metalhead more excited about what Pantera was doing to music, now that they had Phil and a major label deal, the twee tones of Roll the Bones had me casting that record aside, pretty quick. Sure, there's always excitement around a Rush album, and this one, for some reason, generated a bit more than usual. But still, I wasn't happy. When Counterparts launched, to my mind, Rush was back. The music was full-bodied, the writing not appreciably different, but it wasn't hobbled by a lightness that brought the already underpopulated trio down to what seemed like 2.5 or 2.25 members. I loved the record, loved the resonance of the bass, the boom of the drums, the authority howling out of the guitars. Test for Echo left me cold, like the album cover. And then right after, we all had to deal with the shock of the horror that was Neil's personal life after the death of his daughter, Selena, and then his common-law wife, Jackie. Maybe it was the end of Rush. Alex and Geddy both had solo albums that sounded like Rush in the 90s. and there were 100 other flavors. Yes, maybe this was the end. Fortunately, it was not to be. Neil mended as best as could be expected under the circumstances, and the band returned with a masterful new record, Vapor Trails. I don't know what it is about this record, but putting aside the dark wisdom of its lyrics, it's arguably the best of a top-shelf canon thus far. I felt like this was the first time since Grace Under Pressure that the band had created a whole new style of music, and it was art at the same time. I loved the record, still do. Old mix, remix. I've always got time for Vapor Trails. So then, a weird thing happens. I do the Contents Under Pressure book, and then work at Banger on the movie. Add another couple of Rush books later on, get interviewed for a couple of Rush docs, and suddenly, Rush reminds me of work. I imagine that's where I am any time I even think to put a Rush record on. This reticence fades, fortunately. But yes, here I am living in Toronto, and it's all Rush all the time, and I'm full up. But then, God Love the Guys, Snakes and Arrows is issued, and it's all fresh again. Something has shifted since Vapor Trails. Whether it's new producer Nick Raskulinecz or just the band's typical rapid growth, suddenly there's a new sound, if I can generalize, one characterized by warmth along with acoustic guitars, massaged in with electrics. Next came Clockwork Angels, and little did we know it would be the last. Not only was this a record that lived lively like its predecessor, but there was an additional heaviness due to the subtraction of the acoustics. What's more, Rush delivered their first concept album proper, after stopping at a full side in the past. Here they barreled on through a somewhat befuddling plot, but one brimming with rich imagery with the addition of steampunk to the stew, which was stressed more through the stage sets of the tour. Then it was all over, with a languid goodbye, the band touring the record proper, and then embarking on something called R40, a 40th anniversary tour that found the band playing songs from their catalog in reverse chronological order, making progressively modest their stage set in tandem, until there they were, 3 kids rocking songs from 1974. 4 years and 5 months after the band's last show, the shocking news reverberated through the rock community that Neil had died, and it was horribly clear to all that the soft retirement of Rush was final. More, unfortunately, on this later, but there you go. That's where Rush ends, and that's where we can end this set of 3 books. This particular tome celebrating the biggest expanse of years and the worst news imaginable. But on the happy side, there is a raft of records similar to those covered in both Anthem and Limelight. In any event, thanks for reading along. Whether you parachuted in here with modern Rush or have been following the bouncing ball since the first book, I'm glad to share my deep appreciation of Rush with you. Without further ado, in the immortal words of the professor, why are we here? Because we're here. Roll the bones. Martin Popoff. Chapter 1. Roll the bones. We keep looking for the better version of Rush. Here's how the 90s started for Rush. 1 week after Geddy, Alex, and Neil would propose an austere something or other called Roll the Bones, Guns N' Roses would drop 2 near-double albums, Use Your Illusion 1 and Use Your Illusion 2. Another week goes by, and on September 24th, 1991, Nirvana offered for your consideration their second album, Nevermind, led by a little something called Smells Like Teen Spirit. Roll the Bones did not sound like Guns N' Roses or Nirvana, nor did it sound like really anything out there, and that's not necessarily a good thing, other than Presto, Rush's similarly thin, mild, and modest record from 2 years previous, when the band was facing the same realities, hair metal, grunge, and thrash, at the fore. Rush's brand of progressive bonsai tree and origami pop, a curious thing, but let's go see Rush anyway. But credit to the guys, in one sense. They were believing in the stark and odd and oddball evolutionary path they were on, and damn the torpedoes. Rupert Hine returned as producer, signifying that they thought they got it right on Presto. Rupert was in a sort of fourth-member role in the Rush cabal, which helps underscore the identity of any given project. We felt we were missing something, figures Geddy, on the importance of these strong outside voices. We felt we weren't learning enough. It's like going into a fantastic restaurant and seeing all these great dishes and wanting to try all of them. That's how we were. We felt like we had this great start. We had this great upbringing, and we learned a hell of a lot about making records. We were born into this rock world. And we had some tools, and we wanted to refine those tools. And the only way to do that was to work with more people, different people. Because of the style of music we played, there was a real bias against kind of progressive heavy metal. And we found it difficult to work with all the producers we wanted to work with. And so every time out, we had a new list of people. We came into this whole mode of unearthing producers that maybe would be unlikely people for us to work with, but we felt had some real heart as producers, and that started the whole thing. It's like, when it's time to make a record, let's dig up the names, let's pick up the lists. Who can we find? Who is out there? Who is just coming into his own as a producer? And can we grab some of that excitement? In the early days of doing that, it was experience we were after. I think now, and especially with Nick, it's youthful energy with a different attitude toward making records. And that's a way for us to stay current. We can't help being who we are, and we're not going to work with anybody else. There's the three of us, and we're dedicated to that. So what's the easiest thing to change? It's the people around you when you make a record. That's the easiest way. And for me, the smartest way of bringing new energy, new ideas into an old idea. Rush, you know? A 40-year-old idea. Reflects Rupert. At the time, because of the urge to keep things fresh, you were looking for all kinds of ways of moving the parts around, and some input, some random input. That just marks them as wanting to stay in the world of making records together, because they could have split up. They could have formed 3 independent bands based on each other and done a million things with the kind of fan base they had, and still had a pretty good living. But they were never tempted to do that. And the odd solo record is always very much a sidebar project. There's the absolute will to stay together and find out just how far these 3 people in each other's pockets can travel. And I don't think it's ever a scramble. I don't think it's ever desperate. I think it's always willful. It's always thought about in advance. It's always, to a degree, calculated, in terms of the moment they ask this random input to come into their world. It's a calculated decision about a point that's been well thought out by them. They're in masterful control of their lives and the band's direction. That in itself is so unique. It's one of the many truly unique things about this band. Typical of the civilized men of letters that they were, Rush went on a writing retreat in advance of making the new record, holing up at Chalet Studio in Claremont, Ontario for 2.5 months to write, each in their long-standing roles. When not birdwatching and repairing bird feeders, Geddy and Alex would put music to Alex's rudimentary drum machine patterns, the two convening with Neil in the evening to see what they could cook up together. As with Presto, writing centered around guitar, bass, and drums, and not keyboards, with a heavy emphasis on vocal melodies as well. Common parlance would eventually position the Rupert Hine years as the singing era, where Geddy would shift the attention he was placing on keyboards over to the making of memorable vocal melodies, or melodies that played a stronger role in the song, almost as a fourth instrumental narrative. It felt to me very much like a part of 2, agrees Rupert. But the second part built on how they felt about part 1, meaning Geddy liked that his voice was in these different registers. He understood why I thought it had made a difference, and he liked it. And I think they were encouraged by the 3-piece idea again, in minimalizing the keyboards. We carried on doing that, and so there's probably even less keyboards on that record. And there weren't many on Presto, certainly not compared with the previous 2 albums. But I find it hard not to think of them as one piece. I'm not sure I went on the second album with anything like the objectives we had for the first. because it had seemed like the objectives had made sufficient change, and the band had themselves compounded on that change. I would say things were amplified. There was no real, well, the one thing we got wrong with Presto was blah blah blah, so this time we'll try this. I think everything was compounded, which was encouraging from my perspective. It seemed to be starting off with an enthusiastic kick up the bum. In other words, the guys were happy with what they had done on Presto. Even if there were less keyboards, no one at this time was concerned with heavy rocking Rush. Alex was exploring texture, color, atmosphere, funk, and acoustic guitar. And all 5 of those descriptives tend to put the guitar in a supportive role. In support of what? Well, vocals, and thus almost automatically, lyrics. Bass would and could be moderately busy in that wee and twee box, drums slightly less so, pretty much on par with guitar. All of this adds up to a hermetically sealed bubble of Rush's own making, a contrivance even, albeit one that moves along an evolutionary path. Forget what's happening with surging wider tidal musical gyres. There's this thing we are doing, and we'd like you to hear it. I don't recall ever having a discussion with individual Rush members about any other band or music, muses Rupert. Of course, I was only too happy to keep any sonic interference out of the way, and just look at the purity of what the band can do. That's not strictly true, because you've just rung a bell. I do remember talking to Neil about Living Color, but I imagine with respect to some relatively ideological stance, nothing directly affecting the band. I mean, I delighted in the fact that not once did Alex ever say to me, "You know, for this track I sort of thought the sound of the guitar could be a bit like—" Never went there. And almost every band, it's like, "You know that sound of that part on so-and-so's track, when they do that?" And you work from there. I always love the idea that you have an absolutely blank page for everything, for every song, for every album, for every part. You just start with, well, I wonder what we could do to make this part really sing, really work, you know? And not to jump outside of any frame of reference other than your own, so you can dig into some mad little demo that you did on a Matchbox 10 years ago and say, "Here, look, I love this," and, "Oh yeah, let's take that." That will just be more intensely them. Just borrow from your own oeuvre. I can't say that Roll the Bones is part of the era when the Seattle sound was out. It feels to me like we were in absolute isolation of it. But I wouldn't really encourage them in any other way than to be aware. You can't not be aware if you're musical. I'm not suggesting people go and live on an island and listen to nothing. You've got to soak in the musicality of the planet without a doubt. But you're going to do that anyway, if your eyes are open and you're musical. I don't think I've ever known where Rush is in the musical landscape, to be quite honest, chuckles Geddy. I don't think any of us do. And that's a blessing, because we go in and do what we think is fun to do and what is cool to do. Yeah, we listen to other things and we try to bring new things in. At that time, it was kind of the beginning of rap and hip-hop and all this. And Neil wrote this really funny kind of piss take on this whole thing. And we thought, why don't we throw that in the song? And that's how that whole middle section of Roll the Bones came to be. It was just us having fun playing this goofy background kind of rhythmic track and then rapping on it. So we basically have no plan. I think a lot of bands do have a grand plan, master plan, and we don't really have that. At the start of a record, we just don't know what's going to happen. We just let it happen. Certainly I wanted to improve the songwriting on the Roll the Bones album, because I had that feeling we were more style than content on Presto. That was kind of the residue that was left with me from Presto. The pass was really strong, but a lot of the other songs on that album didn't really stay with me from a song resonance point of view. And so we really focused on the songwriting, and I think we nailed that. I think a lot of the songs on Roll the Bones are really strong. But we're always experimenting, continues Geddy. I mean, just because we got successful doesn't mean we're going to stop. That's the way I look at it. We couldn't have gone in and done moving pictures all over again. But we're not really well built for that. We're too curious. We're too dissatisfied with where we're at. So we feel we have to keep moving. We have to find the better Rush, you know? We keep looking for the better version of Rush. And even though we've got this great success, oh, that's great, we've got success, we can do headline shows, we can spend more money on productions. It afforded us a hell of a lot of latitude. But it didn't change that feeling when we get together to work on our music. Okay, what will make us better? What will make us better writers, better producers, better players? That's the motivation. Maybe it seems like we just started experimenting after that time. But if you look at the first Rush album and then listen to Fly By Night, they're completely different records. What does By Tour and the Snow Dog have to do with Finding My Way? Worlds apart. That's when the experimenting started. And then look at Caress of Steel. That's an experiment on hash oil. We've always experimented. We've also always been pigeonholed and categorized. Most bands are, I guess. But I felt there was always more to us than the labels that were attached to us. I felt there was more going on. And we were easily written off as a three-piece metal band or a prog band or a sword and sorcery band. Maybe that's a motivator for us in a way. Keep trying to shuffle those labels off of us, you know. At the end of the day, though, we're a hard rock band. I've said that many times. I identify with that, and I think we would all agree about that. If we had to be labeled anything, it would be a hard rock band. The guys were so prepared coming out of the writing sessions for Roll the Bones that the performances and arrangements on the demos were referenced quite closely, with Neil nailing his meticulously mapped drum parts with ruthless efficiency. The album was recorded between February and May of '91, using the idyllic and storied studio in Morin Heights, as well as Maclear Place, back home in Toronto. Thanks in the album's liner notes would go to the Byrds, reflecting Geddy's new hobby, and CNN, which the guys watched a lot, staying abreast of the news. Things went so smoothly. Drums and bass put down in 4 days, guitars in 8. The guys finished 2 months early, moving the release date 3 months forward from the initially proposed January of 1992. We sort of do that, mused Alex, on using Rupert Hine for a second time. We like to give a producer a couple of chances. The experience was positive. Everything seemed to go well. The album did well. And I don't think we had any fears of working with him again. We thought that would be a good thing, so we just continued. Rupert has a great sense of musicality, arrangement, songwriting. That's really what he brought to the whole project. We're pretty set in our ways. We know what we want to achieve. It's nice that we have somebody there to guide it along and make some of the decisions that we don't want to make. And I think that record got a little more meat on it. It was a little heavier or harder. Good songs, and some good arrangements. But it's a funny thing with us, working with producers at least a couple of times. Maybe once you haven't realized the depth of the relationship and how far you can go. I mean, we always learn from everybody we work with. That's always key. I wonder now if we should just do it once and move on, and go with the unknown. That's exciting and challenging. With Terry, during those first few years, we were recording 2 albums a year, so it was a different environment. We hadn't reached the stage where we incorporated other instruments. The band was simpler in its form and very comfortable with Terry. But after 9 records, it was really time for us to move on and work with other people. You don't want to stay in the same place ever, continues Lifeson. It's boring, and you get itchy and antsy, and you want to move on. And that's always been the thing with us. It's easy to do something over and over and over and over, like some current bands that are very popular, that have a particular sound and a very identifiable singer's voice. They just create the same album over and over. It's a great success, and that's fine, but eventually that ends, and it's over. And there's no growth. There's no development. You can look back and say, well, I made a lot of money, and that's all fine and good. But really, what does it do for you? It's always been key for us to change and to move forward. We experimented a lot. We've taken some chances and we tried some things, and we haven't always been successful. And our fans have been vocal about those things, what they like and what they don't like. And I'm kind of proud of the stuff I don't like. Because we learned from it, and we're always moving forward. We're always thinking about how to approach something in a different way. Well, not albums, laughs Alex, not willing to say whole records failed. Some songs are certainly weaker. And of course you feel this once you get more distance from the album. They can't be helped. We never started with 20 songs and burned it down to the best 12. We always work on those 12, and that's all you get. So it's do them all 100%. Invariably, there are some weaker songs than others. There's a lot of information, a lot of music to work on. That's why we have producers, someone to bounce ideas off of and help you feel a little more focused. There are some arrangements that haven't worked, some songs that haven't worked, sounds at times, little things that just don't get me to 100% satisfaction. That restlessness, again, is something Rupert Hine greatly appreciated in the band. He recalls, "I do remember having a chat, mainly with Neil, although the whole band were there, about how much we admired David Bowie for being the finest example of an artist who will risk losing half his fans, and he often did, on each new album. But he always picked up the same amount of fans who'd never bought a record of his before, album after album after album, all the way through the 70s, and half the 80s at least. I would speak to so many people who said, 'I've never liked a David Bowie record before, but this new one's fantastic. I actually went out and bought it.' And you know there's one just like him who's not bought it for the first time. And Bowie would continue this process, which kept him fresh and at the absolute top of his game for like 15 to 18 years. Neil loved that idea," continues Rupert. "With a band, it's much, much harder to do. Some would say almost impossible. Certainly to do it to the degree that David Bowie did it. Rush have done it, I think, probably more than any other band in trying that idea out, to keep themselves fresh, to make their writing have new purpose. Neil particularly, who after all is the textual voice of the band. He's the one the responsibility falls on each time to make sense of each individual song and the whole album. It's a contextual and very much textual parallel route. I'm not saying that Geddy and Alex haven't contributed to a lyric, but Neil often writes these completed lyrics, and they're presented to the band as a complete idea, which in and of itself is unusual and really good. From a producer's point of view, that is the best, because right from the get-go you know exactly what you're trying to do with this song, what's being communicated. I hate when you're working with a band that haven't gotten the lyrics together yet. We've got a line in the chorus which is going to go blah blah blah, so we're recording arbitrary parts to a song that's not yet saying anything. Given his bond with Neil over lyrics, Rupert figures it might have been Peart who wanted him as the band's producer more than anybody else. Thinking about it now, yes, I know the idea originated with Neil. Often the most conceptual discussions about the album and its music, as opposed to its arrangement and production, would always come from Neil. I would assume that's because he's the man in charge of the words that come out of Geddy's mouth. The voice piece of Rush, the horn, if you like, is Geddy's voice, but the motor is Neil. I feel that he is often driving the band's ideology. It's collective, of course. Sooner or later it's collective. But I feel that the essences of change probably start with Neil. They certainly felt like they did in the 2 albums I worked on. But I'm imagining that's probably always true. If Neil is the engine that drives the ideology of Rush, Hine figures that. Geddy is the MD of the band, the musical director. He's involved in everything, even guitar solos and what have you. Always lovingly, never unpleasant or provocative in a bad way. He would be the organizer, the equivalent of a tour manager. That's the pragmatic side. But to me it's always, what are we trying to do with this record that I've been invited to be a big part of? What's the point of doing this record apart from it being number 14 in your lifelong story? What are we going to do that's going to make this chapter really significant? What is it that you guys want to say? And as soon as you use a word like say, and I would all the time, you feel everyone looking toward Neil. The voice of Rush is Neil. He was always at the epicenter. On the day-to-day stuff, it was Geddy. And Geddy is such a lovely chap, a fantastic man to work with, bright mind.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?